At 11:43 at night, my phone illuminated with a photo from Maui. My husband wore a wedding lei beside the woman who sits beside me at morning meetings. His message read, "Just married my business partner. You are pathetic, by the way." I did not cry or smash the device. I simply typed 2 words and opened my laptop. What Gavin and Sloane failed to understand was that this pathetic wife had already written their ending. My name is Ella Ward. I am 39 years old, and I build things back from the wreckage. Living in the humid heart of Atlanta, I am the founder and absolute majority shareholder of Harbor Slate Recovery Group. We are a private operational firm, but what we really do is manage chaos. When Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes shatter the coastlines of the American Southeast, my teams are the ones who breathe life back into the dead zones. We rebuild the operational infrastructure for coastal hospitals, coastal school districts, and massive commercial high-rises. We ensure that when the floodwaters recede, civilization can actually turn the lights back on. I manage disaster, mitigate ruin, and spot structural weaknesses for a living. I should have seen the one brewing in the foundation of my own home. It was nearing midnight on a Tuesday. I was sitting alone at my expansive mahogany desk in my home office, the blue glow of my dual monitors reflecting against the dark, rain-streaked window panes. I was meticulously reviewing the compliance files for a massive multi-state contract bid. It was a deal substantial enough to alter the entire financial trajectory of my firm for the next 10 years. The house was perfectly silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning. That was when the screen of my phone lit up on the far edge of my desk, vibrating once against the polished wood. It was a text message from my husband, Gavin Vale. The message was devastatingly brief. "Just married my business partner. You are pathetic, by the way." Attached beneath that cruel string of words was a high-resolution image. I picked up the phone. I tapped the image. The screen expanded to show Gavin standing on a pristine white sand beach in Maui. The Pacific Ocean, a vibrant turquoise behind him. He was draped in a traditional, lush green wedding lei. Beside him, pressing her body against his side, stood Sloane Mercer. Sloane, the woman I had personally poached from our most aggressive corporate rival exactly 3 years ago. I had spent countless hours training her, mentoring her through the intricate politics of disaster recovery, and eventually elevating her to the coveted role of operating partner at Harbor Slate. I had given her the literal keys to my professional kingdom. I had invited her to my home for Thanksgiving dinners. Now, she was wearing a form-fitting white silk slip dress, leaning her head against my husband's shoulder, holding a bouquet of tropical flowers. A betrayed wife in a standard daytime television drama would have screamed. She would have hurled her glass of sparkling water across the room, shattered her phone against the drywall, or collapsed into a weeping, hysterical heap on the vintage Persian rug. I did not do any of those things. I do not do theatrics. I do logistics. I looked at the bright photograph on my screen not as a weapon aimed at my heart, but as a critical piece of evidence. I used 2 fingers to pinch the screen and zoom in. I noted the angle of the ambient golden hour lighting, placing the time of the ceremony right around sunset on Hawaii Aleutian Standard Time. I zoomed in on Gavin's left hand to confirm the heavy gold band catching the fading sunlight. I studied the slight, triumphant smirk playing on Sloane's lips, the way her hand rested possessively flat against Gavin's chest. I absorbed every single pixel of their betrayal, cataloging it without a single tear obscuring my vision. My pulse remained entirely steady, beating a calm rhythm in my ears. I tapped the reply field. My fingers moved across the keyboard with cold, deliberate precision. "Enjoy the reception." I pressed send. Then, I placed the phone face down on the desk, cutting off the image of their smiling faces. I turned my attention back to my laptop monitors. The massive multi-state contract could wait until morning. I opened a new, highly encrypted browser window and logged directly into the master administrative portal for Harbor Slate Recovery Group. I was the sole founder. I held the ultimate master key to the entire kingdom. My hands did not shake as I navigated through the complex layers of the user control dashboard. I located Gavin's senior executive profile and Sloane's operating partner profile. With a sequence of deliberate, heavy keystrokes, I initiated Protocol 0. It was a severe emergency override I had quietly built into the architecture of our system for catastrophic internal data breaches. I ruthlessly revoked their administrative access to all project management software. I permanently disabled their electronic signature tokens, rendering them incapable of signing so much as a lunch receipt on behalf of the company. I scrubbed their permissions for the secure bidding data rooms, locking them out of all future revenue streams. Finally, I severed their connection to the corporate financial systems, the payroll ledgers, and the external vendor payment networks. In a span of time, measuring less than 2 hours, Gavin and Sloane were completely and utterly locked out of every crucial digital gateway of the company they arrogantly thought they controlled. They were stranded thousands of miles away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with absolutely no access to company funds, no ability to authorize pending contracts, and no way to log in and cover their digital tracks. This silent execution was not a crime of passion. This was not a frantic, emotional act of revenge executed in the heat of a midnight discovery. I had been methodically preparing this exact containment protocol for over 7 months. I knew exactly what they were doing, and what they were planning, long before they ever boarded that first-class flight to Hawaii. The digital lockout I just performed was merely the final, satisfying turn of a key in a reinforced lock I had installed myself. Once the digital fortress was secure, I opened my private, secure personal server, a system completely isolated from the main Harbor Slate network. I created a new, heavily encrypted directory. I carefully downloaded the high-resolution wedding photograph. I exported the entire text message chain, preserving the exact phrasing of his insult. I captured the server routing logs, confirming the exact minute and second the message was transmitted across the network. I utilized a specialized software tool to extract the hidden location metadata embedded deep within the image file, pinpointing the precise latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates of their beachside ceremony. I dragged every single piece of pristine digital evidence into the newly created directory. I typed the name of the folder Maui. I sat back in my heavy leather executive chair and listened to the absolute, reigning silence of my house in Atlanta, thousands of miles away. Gavin was likely raising a glass of expensive champagne, toasting to his new life, his beautiful new wife, and what he foolishly believed was his newly stolen corporate empire. He genuinely thought he had just delivered the final, crushing blow to a weak, pathetic woman. He thought he had decisively ended me. He was entirely, spectacularly wrong. Gavin had not written the ending to my story. He had simply handed me the opening exhibit for a corporate and marital lawsuit that was going to systematically dismantle his professional reputation, void his standing in the industry, and annihilate his financial future. The storm had just made landfall on his life, and unlike him, I was the one who knew exactly how to navigate the absolute wreckage. 7 months ago, the foundation of my reality was completely intact, or so it appeared from the outside. I am not the type of woman who jumps at shadows or fabricates conspiracies out of thin air. My entire career, my entire fortune, is built on a singular, defining skill. I identify structural anomalies before the building actually collapses. Whether it is a hairline fracture in a concrete support pillar after a Category 5 hurricane, or a micro fissure in a complex logistical supply chain, I see the patterns long before anyone else even knows a pattern exists. When I first met Gavin, I had already established Harbor Slate as a formidable entity. Gavin was not an operator. He was a brand builder. He was a man composed of custom-tailored suits, effortless charm, and an uncanny ability to read a room. He was a master of the corporate narrative. He possessed that rare, magnetic charisma that could convince a boardroom full of aggressively skeptical investors that the future was painted whatever bright, profitable color he chose to describe. I was the grit of the operation. He was the glossy finish. After we married, Bringing him into the executive suite at Harbor Slate felt like a highly strategic, natural progression. I desperately needed someone to manage the optics, to handle the endless networking dinners and the political handshakes, while I remained in the trenches managing the actual disaster zones. 3 years after Gavin joined the firm, Sloane Mercer walked into our corporate orbit. She was an absolute revelation in operational management. I had watched her tear through logistical bottlenecks at our biggest competitor, and I ruthlessly poached her. Sloane was fast, she was razor sharp, and she possessed a relentless, grinding endurance that mirrored my own. I saw a reflection of my younger self in her ambition. Over time, I handed her a level of executive autonomy and trust that I had never granted to anyone else in my entire professional life. I believed she was the future of the company. The shifts in their behavior did not announce themselves with dramatic flair. They were microscopic, subtle deviations from the established baseline. I noticed the classic clichés of corporate infidelity, but they were executed with a high degree of operational discipline. A cell phone abruptly placed screen down on the granite kitchen island when I walked into the room. Routine business trips to coastal recovery sites that mysteriously extended by 24 or 48 hours, with absolutely no corresponding increase in billable deliverables or project progress. Expense reports for client dinners crossed my desk where the timestamp on the restaurant receipt simply did not align with the duration of the supposed strategic meetings. Then came the administrative nudges. Gavin began to casually slide heavy document folders across my desk at the most chaotic possible moments, usually right as I was about to board a helicopter to survey a hurricane impact zone. "Just some routine governance update packages," Gavin would say, flashing that perfectly calibrated, reassuring smile of his. "We are just streamlining our board resolutions for the new fiscal year. Sign here, here, and here, sweetheart, and I will get these filed with legal." I never signed anything blindly. I always told him I would review the clauses on the flight. When I finally read the fine print in the quiet hum of the cabin, I noticed the language in those updates was unusually dense. They contained subtle, buried clauses designed to alter our quorum requirements and slightly shift the weight of executive voting structures. It was nothing explicitly dangerous on its own, but it was unnecessary. The actual breaking point, the moment the illusion shattered, was painfully, almost comically mundane. It was not a lingering glance or a misplaced hotel keycard. It was a standard vendor reimbursement spreadsheet. I was sitting alone in the office late one Friday evening, running a routine quarterly audit on our secondary supply chains. My eyes scanned thousands of rows of data. Then, I stopped. There was a discrepancy on a single line item for a heavy debris removal contractor based in Florida. It was an overage of exactly $4,500. In a company doing hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue, it was less than a rounding error. It was invisible, but that exact same rounding error, for that exact same obscure contractor, appeared in the exact same vendor column for 3 consecutive quarters. A mistake happens once, a system error happens twice. A pattern happens 3 times. I did not confront Gavin when I went home that night. I did not call Sloane into my office on Monday morning and demand an explanation. Confrontation without absolute leverage is simply a negotiation, and I do not negotiate from a position of weakness, especially not with people undermining me inside my own house. Instead, I quietly retained Miriam Cross. She is a ruthless, brilliant corporate governance attorney based out of Chicago, deliberately chosen because she was completely insulated from our Atlanta business network and had no social ties to Gavin. Through Miriam, I hired Owen Hart, a notoriously meticulous forensic accountant who specialized in unspooling complex corporate fraud and hidden asset trails. I gave them a very specific mandate: the investigation had to remain entirely off our internal Harbor Slate servers. Every piece of data had to be gathered externally to maintain a pristine, uncompromised chain of evidence that would hold up under the brutal scrutiny of a federal courtroom. If there was a true betrayal happening, I needed the information legally clean. It took Owen exactly 14 days to follow the digital trail of those minor thousands of dollars. He did not find evidence of a simple hotel room affair. He found a newly registered corporate entity. We sat in Miriam's austere, soundproofed conference room in Chicago when Owen slid a plain manila folder across the table toward me. Inside was the registration paperwork for a shell liability company incorporated in the state of Delaware. The name printed on the official state registry was Vail Mercer Advisory. "They are acting as a phantom toll booth," Owen explained, his voice low and clinical. "Vail Mercer Advisory is quietly siphoning consulting fees and referral bonuses from the very subcontractors Harbor Slate employs for our disaster recovery projects. They are skimming off the top of your operational budget. But the embezzlement was only the shallow end of the corruption." Owen had dug significantly deeper, penetrating the metadata of the draft agreements floating between the private, encrypted email servers Gavin and Sloane thought were secure. Miriam placed a second stack of documents in front of me. These were draft board resolutions, heavily annotated. The infidelity was merely a footnote to their actual ambition. The documents outlined a meticulous, legally phased strategy. They had mapped out a strict timeline to completely restructure the board of directors. Planning to utilize those exact routine governance updates, Gavin had kept pressuring me to sign on my way out the door. "Look at Phase 3, Miriam said, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the paper. "Their goal is to legally dilute your controlling shares. They want to push you completely out of operations and transition you into a symbolic figurehead role with no voting power." I read the final page of the executive summary they had drafted. Once I was stripped of my real operational control. They planned to package a massive equity stake of Harbor Slate and sell it to a major private equity investment fund. The fund would not agree to the acquisition if a strong, independent founder like me still held the reins. I was the obstacle. They were going to neutralize me, cash out, and walk away incredibly wealthy. I closed the folder. The ambient noise of the Chicago traffic 20 stories below seemed to fade into absolute silence. The physical betrayal, the thought of my husband's hands on the woman I had mentored, felt suddenly distant, almost irrelevant in the face of this new reality. A cold, terrifying, and profound clarity settled over my skin. They were not just sleeping together in the shadows. They were systematically conspiring to steal my company, my professional reputation, and the entire future I had built from absolute zero. They thought I was a blind, trusting wife who would eventually sign the right papers and quietly fade into the background. They did not realize they had just declared war on the architect of their entire existence. The night of the Maui text stretched out before me, a vast, dark expanse that demanded immediate structural reinforcement. I did not walk over to the antique bar cart in the corner of my office to pour a heavy glass of bourbon. I did not pick up my phone to call my oldest friend and collapse into a puddle of weeping hysteria. Panic is an inefficient use of resources. An emotional collapse is a luxury reserved for people who are not currently under siege. Instead, I pulled up a blank, secure document on my laptop and began to type. I created a 12-point crisis management checklist. This was no different than coordinating a multi-state response after a Category 5 hurricane had decimated the regional power grid. The objective was the exact same: isolate the damage, secure the surviving assets, and neutralize the immediate threats. Item 1 was the absolute neutralization of all executive-level electronic signature tokens. I knew the rhythm of their panic. If Gavin and Sloane were sitting in a luxury suite in Hawaii, flush with the adrenaline of their supposed victory, the very first thing they would attempt to do was finalize the paperwork they needed to lock me out. They would try to push through those last few delayed governance documents or sign off on the preliminary terms for the private equity sale. I opened the vendor portal for our secure document signing software and completely wiped their digital identities from the system. Any document bearing their digital footprint was instantly rendered legally void. Item 2 required shifting my focus to the corporate treasury. I logged into the secure, encrypted portal for our primary commercial bank. Several years ago, anticipating the inherent risks of internal financial mismanagement as Harbor Slate grew, I had established a highly confidential safeguard protocol. It was a strict limitation on unusual disbursements operating completely outside our standard payroll and pre-approved vendor schedules. I drafted a priority legal notice to the Senior Vice President of Commercial Banking who managed our accounts. I formally requested the immediate, temporary suspension of any outgoing wire transfers or bulk disbursements exceeding $50,000. The message was concise and devoid of any emotional context. I cited a pending internal governance audit. Item 3 was deploying the heavy artillery. It was well past midnight in Chicago, but I drafted an urgent, encrypted email to Miriam Cross and Owen Hart. I did not waste time detailing the emotional betrayal. My instructions were strictly tactical. I ordered them to immediately begin drafting emergency injunction filings based on the accumulated evidence of extreme breach of fiduciary duty, systemic financial fraud, and the blatant, calculated dissipation of marital assets. I needed the legal paperwork completely ready to file the moment the courthouse doors opened on the East Coast. Item 4 brought the war directly to the front door. Gavin had always viewed our expansive townhouse in Atlanta as his domain, entirely ignoring the inconvenient legal reality that the property was held securely within my own personal premarital trust. He operated under the arrogant assumption that, when push came to shove, he could simply leverage my emotional attachment to force a favorable concession. I opened the smart home security application on my phone. I systematically deleted his biometric data from the front gate access panel, erased his entry codes for the main doors, and remotely disabled his garage transponder. His keycards were now nothing more than useless pieces of plastic, with the perimeter secured. I turned my attention back to the internal server logs of Harbor Slate. I needed to see exactly what they were doing in the immediate aftermath of sending that photograph. I ran a deep diagnostic trace on the active user sessions. The results populated on my screen, and they were almost painfully predictable. Exactly 18 minutes after Gavin transmitted the text message declaring they were married, the system registered 2 distinct login attempts targeting the secure digital data room. That specific data room housed all the highly confidential financial disclosures, the intellectual property registries, and the proprietary operational manuals required for their planned equity sale. They had barely finished cutting their wedding cake before they opened their laptops to try and finalize the theft of my life's work. I worked with the cold, methodical precision of a crime scene investigator. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the entire access log. I meticulously documented the incoming Internet Protocol addresses, tracing them directly back to the secure wireless network of a highly exclusive luxury resort in Maui. I logged the specific time zones, the exact device identification numbers, and the precise sequence of files they had desperately attempted to open before my security lockdown forcibly terminated their sessions. I built an unbreakable, cryptographic chain of evidence that undeniably proved Gavin and Sloane were actively attempting to execute a massive corporate fraud mere minutes after their supposed wedding ceremony. By the time I finished the 12th item on my list, the digital clock on my monitor read 3:45 in the morning. My eyes burned, and a dull, heavy ache had settled at the base of my skull. I opened a secure digital note on my phone. I needed a directive, a single guiding principle to carry me through the brutal days ahead. I stared at the blinking cursor, my fingers hovering over the glass screen. I typed a single sentence: "Do not react to the betrayal. React to the pattern." I placed the phone face down on the cool mahogany surface of my desk. I stood up, walked across the room, and switched off the desk lamp, plunging the office into complete darkness. I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, slid between the cold sheets, and closed my eyes. I did not allow myself to think about the years I had spent loving a man who never existed, or the countless hours I had spent mentoring a woman who had plotted my demise. I forced my breathing to slow, demanding that my body accept rest. I had to sleep for at least 3 hours, like a battlefield commander the night before a decisive, bloody offensive. People who are sleep-deprived become emotional. They lose their sharp edge, and they make fatal tactical mistakes. And as the sun prepared to rise over Atlanta, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that I did not have the right to be wrong. The sun rose over Atlanta at exactly 6:45, casting a sharp, pale light across my immaculate home office. My phone had been vibrating relentlessly against the polished mahogany since 5 in the morning. 10 missed calls. 15. 22. All from the same Hawaiian area code, all bearing my husband's name. I did not decline them. I simply let them ring into the absolute silence of the room, watching the screen illuminate and fade like a dying pulse. At 8 o'clock precisely, the ringing abruptly ceased. I knew exactly why. Half a continent away in Chicago, Miriam Cross had just hit send on a certified legal communication directed to Gavin's primary inbox, carbon copying his secondary accounts. The email was a masterpiece of corporate hostility wrapped in pristine legal formatting. It informed him, in no uncertain terms, that, as of that exact minute, any and all communication regarding his employment, his marital status, and his personal assets was to be routed exclusively through her law firm. He was legally forbidden from contacting me directly. The Iron Curtain had descended, simultaneously, thousands of miles away in their luxury resort suite. Sloane Mercer was experiencing her own personalized version of operational hell. We had a massive, multi-million-dollar recovery contract pending with a major hospital network in coastal Florida. It was a deal she had been personally shepherding, one she desperately needed to finalize to inflate the company's valuation for their illicit private equity sale. I pictured her opening her laptop, fresh from her wedding night, her fingers flying across the keyboard to secure the final vendor guarantees. She would have logged into the project management portal, only to find the interface bathed in a dull, sterile gray. I had downgraded her executive access to a restricted, read-only view. She could look at the Florida hospital contracts. She could see the pending deadlines flashing in red. She could read the increasingly urgent messages from the subcontractors. But the authorization buttons, the editing fields, the digital signature prompts, they were all entirely disabled. She was trapped behind a pane of bulletproof digital glass, forced to watch her most critical transactions slowly bleed to death, completely powerless to intervene, locked out of the company servers, legally gagged, and physically barred from the Atlanta townhouse. Gavin defaulted to the only weapon he had left, his silver tongue. He started making frantic phone calls to the sympathetic ears within our advisory board. I had anticipated this exact pivot. He contacted a senior board acquaintance, painting a desperate, tragic narrative. He whispered that I had suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown. He claimed I was acting erratically, locking him out in a fit of hysterical paranoia, and that I posed an active, imminent threat to the stability of Harbor Slate. He was trying to light a fire of panic. I extinguished it before the first spark could even catch. Before Gavin's fabricated rumors could circulate past that single board member, I drafted a preemptive internal memorandum. I distributed it to the entire executive leadership team and the extended advisory board at 8:30 in the morning. The tone of the memo was aggressively mundane. It was the digital equivalent of a polite yawn. Team, the memo read, Harbor Slate is currently undergoing a routine, comprehensive governance and security review, effective immediately. All active recovery projects will proceed exactly as scheduled with zero interruption to client deliverables. Furthermore, any and all out-of-process operational expenditures, non-standard vendor disbursements, and executive access permissions are temporarily paused pending the conclusion of this internal audit. Please direct any procedural questions to the compliance department. Let us maintain our focus on the field. It was a flawlessly executed corporate maneuver. The absolute, unbothered calm of my prose instantly drained the life from Gavin's smear campaign. A woman suffering a catastrophic mental breakdown does not send out impeccably formatted, grammatically perfect directives about vendor disbursements. Despite the memo, the lingering anxiety Gavin had seeded prompted 2 senior advisory board members to arrive at our corporate headquarters at 10 in the morning. They walked into the main glass-walled conference room with grim, questioning expressions, fully prepared to demand an explanation from a supposed hysterical founder. I did not even bother to greet them. I let Miriam Cross handle the reception via a high-definition video conference link from Chicago. "Gentlemen," Miriam stated smoothly from the massive screen, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "The founder is currently occupied with a critical site inspection. However, I have compiled a preliminary legal summary for your review." Miriam had prepared a comprehensive, airtight dossier. She walked them through the foundational bylaws of Harbor Slate, highlighting the exact clauses I had drafted 7 years ago. The documents clearly demonstrated that every single defensive action I had taken over the past 10 hours, the suspension of executive tokens, the freezing of unauthorized accounts, the revoking of physical access, was entirely within my unilateral authority as the sole founder and controlling majority shareholder. I was not acting erratically. I was executing my fiduciary duty to protect the company from an internal security threat. The 2 board members reviewed the flawless legal justification, exchanged a long, defeated glance, and quietly exited the building. The first truly devastating counterstrike of the day arrived just before noon, courtesy of Owen Hart. While Miriam was pacifying the board, Owen had been dissecting the metadata of the draft resolutions Gavin and Sloane had been preparing to oust me. He called me on my secure, encrypted line. "I found the silver bullet," Owen said, his voice crackling with professional satisfaction. "That emergency board resolution Gavin was planning to use to strip your operational authority, the one he claimed was drafted and approved last quarter." "I am listening," I replied, staring out the window of my armored company SUV. "It is a complete fabrication," Owen confirmed. "The digital timestamp on the document signature has been artificially backdated. The metadata proves the file was actually created and signed a mere 3 weeks ago, long after the supposed approval date. Furthermore, it entirely lacks the cryptographically secure approval chain required by your internal software." Gavin forged the timeline to make it look like a legally binding, pre-existing board consensus. This was no longer just a messy corporate divorce or a breach of fiduciary duty. Forging digital timestamps on corporate governance documents to seize control of a multi-million-dollar entity crossed a very thick, very dark legal line. It was actionable, prosecutable fraud. I did not spend the afternoon gloating in my office. I had an image to maintain. I instructed my driver to take me directly to the site of our largest ongoing recovery project, a massive commercial logistics center whose roof had been entirely sheared off by a recent storm. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a standard white hard hat, a high-visibility safety vest, and heavy steel-toed boots. I spent 4 hours walking the muddy perimeter, questioning the lead structural engineers, reviewing the steel reinforcement schedules, and sharply correcting a junior contractor on a safety violation. I stood in the humid, dusty air, barking orders over the roar of heavy machinery. I made sure every single site manager, every subcontractor, and every corporate spy Gavin might have planted saw me in my absolute element. I was not weeping in a luxury apartment. I was not hiding behind my lawyers. I was commanding an army of heavy equipment operators and engineers, sharper, colder, and more intensely focused than I had ever been in my entire career. I forced everyone who wanted to believe the narrative of my destruction to stare directly into the blinding reality of my resilience. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the dust had settled, and the sheer magnitude of the devastation I had unleashed finally reached Maui. Gavin had spent the entire day frantically pulling at every single lever of power he thought he possessed, only to find that the wires had been cut. He could not access his money. He could not leverage the board. He could not manipulate the company narrative. He could not even sleep in his own bed. The most agonizing realization for him was not the cold silence from his wife. It was the slow, crushing understanding that all the heavy, gilded doors he arrogantly thought he held the master keys to had their locks fundamentally changed a long time ago. As the Hawaiian sun began to set on his first full day as a newly married man, the final psychological blow landed. Staring at his dead phone and his locked accounts, Gavin finally understood the horrifying truth. I had not been surprised by the photograph. I had not reacted in a sudden fit of blind, jealous rage. The flawless, impenetrable walls that had slammed down around him in less than 24 hours proved one undeniable fact. I had been watching him, I had been waiting, and I was simply executing a meticulously designed, flawlessly timed plan of total annihilation. The deeper Owen heart dug into the digital wreckage of my husband's life, the more the stench of true desperation began to fill the room. By late Thursday afternoon, Owen requested a secure, encrypted video conference. When his face appeared on my monitor, the professional detachment he usually maintained was entirely gone, replaced by the grim expression of a man who had just uncovered something catastrophic. I pulled the threads on those inflated client entertainment expenses, Owen began, his voice flat and clinical. Gavin was not just buying $5,000 bottles of wine for prospective hospital administrators. He is drowning in offshore sports betting debt. He has been taking out massive, high-interest personal loans to cover his catastrophic losses, and he was using the Harbor Slate corporate expense accounts to quietly service that debt. He was paying off loans with interest rates hovering around 35%, heavily disguised as regional marketing initiatives. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. Gavin had always possessed a polished, controlled exterior. To discover he was a degenerate gambler completely shattered the illusion of the sophisticated brand architect he played so well. "And Sloane?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Owen shared his screen, displaying a complex flowchart of financial routing numbers. "Sloane is the operational muscle behind the theft. That shell company we found, Vale Mercer Advisory, is functioning as an illicit toll booth. She has been systematically shaking down our secondary subcontractors for mandatory referral fees, skimming roughly 10% off the top of their contracts in exchange for guaranteeing them continued work with Harbor Slate. She turned your corporate reputation into a secret, untraceable cash dispenser. They were stockpiling this liquid capital to fund their immediate lifestyle after they finalized the company sale. The sheer audacity of the operation was breathtaking, but the absolute confirmation of their ultimate endgame arrived an hour later, courtesy of a careless digital mistake. Sloane was incredibly meticulous, but she had failed to properly purge a cloud-synchronized folder from her previous corporate tablet. Owen's team recovered a master spreadsheet that had been deleted but not overwritten. The title of the document was Exit Without Ella. I stared at the name of the file on my screen. It was not a vague concept. It was a fully articulated business strategy. The spreadsheet contained a highly detailed 18-month financial projection. It calculated their precise equity payouts, their post-sale executive compensation packages, and their golden parachutes, all modeled on a scenario explicitly labeled post-founder restructuring. Then, Miriam Cross joined the secure call, and the situation devolved from standard financial embezzlement into something profoundly grotesque. "Owen shared the recovered files with me," Miriam said, her tone laced with absolute disgust. "They knew they could not just vote you out without causing a massive panic among your investors and your hospital clients. You are the face of the recovery operations. So, they decided to manufacture a crisis." Miriam brought up a PDF document. It was a drafted, heavily detailed medical dossier. It bore the letterhead of a high-end, discreet psychiatric facility in California. The file contained a completely fabricated psychological evaluation detailing my supposed severe executive burnout, my chronic emotional instability, and a formal medical recommendation that I step down from all operational duties immediately. "They were going to poison the well," Miriam explained, "if you resisted the dilution of your shares. They planned to leak this forged medical file to the advisory board and the private equity buyers. They were going to frame your ouster as a compassionate medical intervention. They wanted the industry to pity you while they robbed you blind." The theoretical threat of their forgery suddenly became an immediate, tangible liability the very next morning. My private line rang. It was the lead escrow agent managing the funds for a massive commercial rebuild project we were executing in Nashville. "I need your verbal confirmation on a structural change order," the agent said, sounding slightly confused. "It just came across my desk. It bears Sloane Mercer's electronic signature, And it authorizes a $75,000 release from the contingency fund to a new vendor. I thought you issued a company-wide freeze on executive disbursements yesterday. My blood turned to ice. When was that document signed? I asked. The digital timestamp shows it was executed late Tuesday afternoon, she replied. 2 days before the Maui text message. The fraud was not merely an ambitious plan living on draft paper, it was an active infection spreading through my current projects. I instructed the agent to immediately halt the transfer and flag the document as fraudulent. I disconnected the call and instantly patched Miriam back in. She did not waste a single second on sympathy. We are shifting from defensive containment to offensive compliance, Miriam commanded. We must initiate a limited self-disclosure with your corporate directors and officers' liability insurance provider right this minute. If we do not officially report this internal fraud to the underwriters immediately, Gavin's legal team will eventually try to argue that you deliberately concealed operational risks from the market. We spent the next 3 hours drafting a highly technical, legally bulletproof disclosure. We were systematically barricading my standing while simultaneously throwing Gavin and Sloane directly into the crosshairs of federal corporate compliance investigators. Once the disclosure was filed, I leaned back in my chair and looked at the large physical calendar hanging on my office wall. I traced the days with my eyes, and suddenly, the entire timeline aligned with a sickening, crystalline clarity. The wedding in Maui had absolutely nothing to do with romance, sunset vows, or an overwhelming desire to be together. The date they chose was exactly 3 days before a massive, closed-door pitch meeting scheduled with a top-tier private equity firm in Austin, Texas. That specific investment fund was notoriously conservative about the management stability of the companies they acquired. Gavin and Sloane could not walk into that boardroom in Austin as a pair of cheating executives embroiled in a messy corporate divorce. The optics would kill the deal instantly. They needed to present a united, legally bound front. They needed to appear as the stable, dynamic, husband and wife operational team ready to take Harbor Slate to the next level. The entire Hawaiian wedding was nothing more than a calculated public relations stunt designed to secure the acquisition capital. I stared at the wall, the silence of the office pressing in around me. This was the exact moment the final lingering shadows of my marital grief simply evaporated. The general public always assumes that the sharpest, most agonizing pain of infidelity is the physical betrayal, the haunting image of your husband intertwined with another woman. But as I sat there, I realized I felt absolutely no jealousy. I did not care that he was sleeping with her. What I felt was a terrifying, profound, and absolute disgust. Gavin had not just broken his personal vows. He had looked at the empire I had built with my own blood. The years of missed sleep, the relentless stress of navigating disaster zones, the pristine reputation I had forged from absolute nothingness, and he saw it only as a pile of chips. He viewed my entire life's work as nothing more than disposable collateral, a convenient asset he could leverage to subsidize his pathetic gambling addiction and stroke his incredibly fragile ego. I closed my laptop with a sharp, definitive click. The narrative had permanently shifted. I was no longer a scorned wife navigating the emotional wreckage of a broken home. I was the chief executive officer of a besieged corporation, and my former partner was a hostile, desperate thief. This was no longer a broken marriage. It was a corporate fraud case, and I intended to make sure neither of them ever touched my company again. Gavin possessed an uncanny ability to read a room, and by the end of that first week, he realized the legal room was completely sealed shut against him. The financial locks were changed, the access tokens were dead, and the forensic evidence Owen Hart was compiling was airtight. Knowing he was suffering a catastrophic defeat on the legal and operational fronts, my husband executed a desperate pivot. He moved the fight to the one arena where he still believed he held the advantage: public relations and media manipulation. On a bright Tuesday morning, a strategically placed blind item evolved into a full-feature article on a highly trafficked Atlanta business news portal. It was heavily, anonymously sourced, but the phrasing possessed the distinct, polished cadence of Gavin's public relations training. The narrative was expertly crafted to assassinate my character. It painted the founder of Harbor Slate as a deeply paranoid woman obsessed with absolute control. A brilliant but impossible tyrant who was a nightmare to work with. The article claimed that my rigid, demanding nature had finally driven my brilliant executive team away, and that I was currently suffering a total psychological collapse after being abruptly abandoned by my charismatic, beloved husband. Sloane immediately capitalized on the momentum of the article. Weaponizing her personal social media platforms, she posted a carefully curated gallery of high-resolution images from Maui. The photos were a calculated blend of romantic idealism and aggressive provocation. There were shots of them holding hands on the beach, their faces glowing with a golden hour filter, alongside long, sprawling captions about the bravery required to live your ultimate truth. She wove a narrative of two brilliant minds finding authentic love while trapped in a toxic, suffocating corporate environment. She expertly positioned herself and Gavin as courageous pioneers breaking free from a cage, while subtly framing me as the bitter, aging, vindictive ex-wife who was illegally using her corporate wealth to enact petty revenge against true love. Rumors always possess a velocity that legal documents simply cannot match. A comprehensive legal injunction takes days to draft, review, and file with the courts. But a scandalous web link can circulate through an entire corporate network in under 10 minutes. I walked through the glass corridors of the Harbor Slate headquarters and felt the distinct, uncomfortable shift in the atmospheric pressure. The junior project managers, the field coordinators, and the younger administrative staff averted their eyes when I passed by. I could see them whispering in the break rooms, huddled over their mobile phones. They were terrified. They were absorbing the toxic narrative that the company was about to fracture under the weight of a horrific divorce, and that their chief executive officer was actively losing her grip on reality. The standard crisis management playbook dictates an immediate counter-narrative. A traditional executive would have hired a high-priced crisis communications firm, drafted a lengthy, emotional press release, or posted a defensive essay on professional networking sites detailing the truth of the betrayal. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not engage in a messy, undignified digital war of words. I simply instructed my assistant to print my boarding pass. It was time for the annual Southeast Recovery Summit in New Orleans. It is the premier, mandatory gathering for disaster logistics professionals, major hospital administrators, and government contractors across the country. I arrived exactly on schedule, bypassing the superficial networking mixers and walking directly into the main convention center. I chose my wardrobe with the precision of a general selecting armor. I wore a minimalist, charcoal gray tailored suit with a sharp cut, no flashy jewelry, and zero concessions to the oppressive Louisiana humidity. I walked onto the main stage under the harsh theater lights to deliver my scheduled keynote address. I did not alter a single word of my presentation. I spoke clearly and methodically for 45 minutes on the absolute necessity of uncompromising financial transparency and strict ethical standards in post-disaster recovery operations. I was sharp, authoritative, and completely unbothered. When the floor opened for the customary question and answer session, the energy in the massive ballroom grew thick and incredibly tense. A reporter from a prominent industry trade publication stood up and took the microphone. He did not ask about supply chain bottlenecks or municipal contracts. He asked the single, aggressive question that every person in the room was desperately thinking. Given the recent, highly publicized, and somewhat dramatic changes in your executive leadership team, the reporter asked, his voice echoing through the silent hall, can you confirm if your husband truly left you to partner with your chief operating officer, and how is this impacting your ability to lead hundreds of industry leaders, aggressive competitors, and potential clients held their collective breath. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for a crack in the armor, a defensive stutter, or an emotional rant that would confirm Gavin's carefully planted rumors of my mental collapse. I did not flinch. I looked directly into the glare of the camera lights, locked eyes with the reporter, and spoke into the microphone. My voice was calm, cold, and projected perfectly across the silent room. They left together. The files did not. I did not elaborate. I did not offer a secondary explanation. I simply nodded to the moderator and moved on to the next question regarding concrete procurement. Those 7 words hit the conference floor like a seismic shockwave. Within minutes, that single, devastating quote was being frantically texted across private industry group chats, whispered on investor conference calls, and repeated in secure boardrooms across the country. In one brutally efficient sentence, the entire public narrative completely inverted. I no longer sounded like a devastated, jilted wife desperately clinging to her fading pride. I sounded exactly like what I was, an apex predator holding an airtight, lethal dossier of financial evidence. The immediate ripple effect of that projected, unbending confidence was catastrophic for Gavin and Sloane, the massive private equity fund located in Austin, Texas, the exact group Gavin and Sloane had been desperately courting to purchase their stolen shares. Reacted exactly as Miriam Cross had predicted. While I was on stage, Miriam formally served the fund's compliance department with a massive legal evidence preservation notice. The document demanded they immediately freeze and retain all communications with Gavin and Sloane regarding any proposed equity sale. Citing an active, massive investigation into corporate fraud and forged governance documents. Private equity funds thrive on calculated financial risk, but they will run from any deal tainted by potentially criminal management fraud. No investment board wants to touch a deal that smells even faintly of forged signatures and embezzlement. The Austin Fund immediately froze all contact. Gavin's frantic phone calls went straight to a generic voicemail. Their multi-million-dollar exit strategy evaporated into thin air in a matter of hours. Later that same afternoon, as I was sitting in the quiet luxury of the airport lounge waiting for my flight back to Atlanta, my personal phone vibrated. It was a direct, private message from the chief executive officer of the largest hospital network in Florida, our most critical and lucrative active client. The message was incredibly brief, devoid of corporate pleasantries, and entirely powerful. It read, "We saw the news articles. We do not care about the social media gossip. We only care about the operations and the people who actually get the concrete poured. We will only continue our recovery contracts with Harbor Slate if you, and only you, remain in absolute, actual control of the firm." It was the ultimate, irrefutable validation of my entire life's work. My reputation stood entirely on its own merit, forged in the fires of real disaster zones, not in the pages of a lifestyle magazine. Gavin had spent years believing he was the magic ingredient that made people trust our company. He genuinely thought that by publicly humiliating me, I would simply curl up in shame, retreat into the shadows, and hand him the remaining pieces of my empire to avoid further embarrassment. Instead, my unbending, silent presence on that stage exposed the absolute, humiliating truth to the entire industry. I was the solid concrete foundation of the enterprise. He was merely a thin coat of glossy paint. And as the day closed, that paint was peeling rapidly, revealing nothing more than a panicked, desperate scammer frantically trying to outrun the undeniable weight of his own lies. The momentum of a corporate collapse is rarely a sudden explosion. It is a series of heavy, inevitable structural failures, once the massive investment fund in Austin pulled their capital. The cracks in Gavin and Sloane's carefully constructed facade widened into gaping chasms. The people they had coerced and manipulated to build their fraudulent framework finally realized that standing next to my husband was no longer a path to a lucrative promotion. It was a severe legal liability. The first person to finally step out of the shadows was Lila Perez. Lila had been the senior executive assistant to both Gavin and Sloane for 4 consecutive years, for weeks. She had been completely paralyzed by the fear of losing her salary and her healthcare benefits. She had watched the digital lockouts happen. She had read my company-wide memorandums. But when my forensic sweep began to aggressively isolate the fraudulent digital footprints, the terror of being indicted as an active co-conspirator finally outweighed her fear of unemployment. She could not stomach the persistent, daily demands to erase their tracks. She did not come to my office. She flew directly to Chicago and walked into Miriam Cross's firm. Leela sat in the polished conference room and surrendered a devastating cache of encrypted text messages and printed directives. Gavin had explicitly ordered her to backdate the official minutes of 3 separate executive board meetings to create a false trail of consensus. He had commanded her to fabricate a detailed digital calendar schedule, complete with fictitious appointments with a prominent California-based psychiatrist who specialized in severe executive burnout. Most damning of all. Lila handed over a drafted email, written entirely by Sloane, intended to be sent from my own personal corporate account. It was a meticulously crafted, highly emotional letter of resignation, citing overwhelming mental fatigue and requesting an immediate, indefinite leave of absence. Before Miriam could fully process the sheer scale of Lila's files, a second vault forcefully unlocked. Jordan Pike, our lead external cybersecurity and information technology contractor, formally requested a secure video meeting with Owen Hart. Jordan had always possessed a rigid, uncompromising moral compass. He brought forward a heavily encrypted hard drive containing every single archived communication Gavin had attempted to route through the secondary private servers. Among those files was a direct, written request from Gavin asking Jordan to illegally clone my master administrative authentication token. Gavin's written excuse was incredibly flimsy and completely out of character for our operations. He claimed I was constantly distracted in the field, dropping my devices in the mud, and repeatedly forgetting my secure passwords. Jordan had instantly recognized the massive security violation. He knew I possessed a flawless memory for security protocols. He had flatly refused the request and quietly flagged the user profile. But Jordan had done significantly more than just refuse. He handed Owen the raw, unfiltered firewall logs. Those logs provided the final, undeniable mathematical proof of their actions on the night of the Hawaiian wedding. They showed a frantic, repeated effort to digitally sign the forged governance documents. The specific internet protocol addresses logged by Jordan's security traps matched the exact Hawaiian luxury resort network metadata I had pulled from their wedding photograph. They had literally been trying to finalize the theft of my company while still wearing their wedding clothes. The most chilling piece of evidence, however, came back to Lila. It was a seemingly innocuous audio file. 3 weeks before the Maui trip, Gavin and Sloane had utilized the main glass conference room for a private, highly sensitive strategy session. They had successfully locked the door and drawn the blinds. But Gavin, in his typical arrogant haste, had failed to completely disconnect the room's integrated digital microphone from the central dictation server. Lila had been tasked with transcribing an earlier meeting and stumbled directly across their private audio recording. Miriam played the file for me over our secure line. The audio was slightly muffled by the glass walls, but Gavin's smooth, heavily modulated voice was absolutely unmistakable. A quiet affair is not going to give us the leverage we need to force the sale, Gavin said on the recording, his tone cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of empathy. If she just catches us sleeping together, she will fire you and divorce me quietly to protect the stock price and the board's confidence. We do not need her sad. We need a shock big enough to make Ella lose control in front of others. We need her screaming in the hallways. We need her to completely break down so the board actually believes the medical file we drafted. I sat in my office, the phone pressed hard against my ear, and listened to my husband plot my total psychological destruction. That was the profound, sickening twist that finally laid the entire conspiracy bare. The sheer cruelty of the late-night text message from Maui was not a spontaneous act of malice or a drunken mistake. It was a highly calculated tactical strike. They had weaponized their betrayal, hoping the sheer violent shock of the photograph would push me into a public, hysterical, and very visible meltdown. They desperately needed me to act like a crazy, unhinged woman so they could legally justify stripping me of my company and my life's work. Armed with this suffocating mountain of evidence, Miriam initiated a brutal legal maneuver. She submitted a heavily redacted summary of the testimonies, the digital logs, and the audio transcript directly to Gavin's newly retained, highly expensive defense attorney. The objective was to let his legal counsel know exactly how unwinnable and legally perilous their position had become. Less than 2 hours after his lawyer received the summary, my private cellular phone vibrated on my desk. It was a direct text message from Gavin. By sending it, he was blatantly violating the strict legal no-contact order Miriam had established days ago. "Ella, please," the message read. "This is getting completely out of hand. The lawyers are just trying to drain our bank accounts and destroy what we have. Let us just sit down and talk about this face to face. Like two rational adults. We can fix this without destroying everything we built together." It was almost laughable. He was entirely cornered, staring straight down the barrel of severe federal fraud charges. And his immediate instinct was to revert to his old manipulative charm. He honestly believed he could still sit across a coffee table from me, flash that perfectly calibrated smile, and negotiate his way out of a felony by appealing to our shared history and my supposed emotional weakness. He wanted to bypass the relentless, clinical machinery of the legal system because he knew the forensic data was currently strangling the absolute life out of his future. I did not reply to him. I did not type a single word of anger, vindication, or sorrow. I simply took a high-resolution screenshot of his message and forwarded it directly to Miriam in Chicago. "Add this to the pile," I instructed her over a brief, clipped phone call. He is actively attempting to circumvent the legal barrier because he is terrified of the formal discovery process. I placed my phone back on the cool surface of my desk. The grand horrific design of their betrayal was now fully illuminated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the legal process. They had constructed a flawless, vicious trap designed to shatter my mind and steal my legacy. They needed Ella Ward to break into a million desperate, weeping pieces, and as I looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, I realized that the absolute, most terrifying thing in their entire world right now was the simple, undeniable fact that I had not broken at all. The next devastating blow to my husband's crumbling empire did not come from a forensic accountant, an angry vendor, or a disgruntled corporate employee. It arrived from a Nashville area code, delivered by the last person I ever expected to step onto the battlefield. Celeste Vale was Gavin's older sister. She was a highly formidable estate litigation attorney who possessed a mind as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. Gavin and Celeste had never been particularly close during our marriage, separated by both geography and fundamental differences in their moral character. I always operated under the cynical assumption that when our corporate war finally became public, the unwritten, ancient laws of blood and family would automatically force her to stand in his corner. I was entirely wrong. Celeste did not call her brother to offer comfort. She booked a direct flight to Chicago and walked straight into Miriam Cross's law firm. She brought a thick, heavy leather briefcase containing a meticulously organized stack of printed email correspondence. These were not recent messages exchanged in the heat of the current scandal. They dated back over 8 months. Miriam arranged a secure video conference so I could listen to the deposition. Celeste sat across from my attorney, her posture rigid, her expression completely devoid of familial sympathy. "I am not here to defend my brother just because we happen to share a last name and a bloodline," Celeste stated firmly, her voice echoing through the speakers in my office. 8 months ago, Gavin started sending me late-night emails. He was asking highly specific, hypothetical legal questions about the mechanisms required to void a post-nuptial agreement. He specifically wanted to know the exact legal threshold required to prove a spouse was psychologically unstable, mentally unfit to manage assets, or posed a direct operational risk to a shared corporate entity. I stared at the screen, my breath perfectly still. I read those emails and felt an absolute chill. Celeste continued. The language he used was too clinical, too cold, and entirely too calculating. He did not ask about divorce mediation or equitable splits. He was explicitly fishing for legal strategies to institutionalize your reputation. I kept every single printed copy because I knew, deep down, My brother was planning something incredibly hollow and vicious. I refused to be complicit in the destruction of an innocent woman. The betrayal ran significantly deeper than the company's servers. Through Celeste's testimony, I discovered that Gavin had been meticulously cultivating his false victim narrative for nearly a year. He had been quietly whispering poison into the ears of his parents and his extended family. He told them I was losing my edge, that the stress of disaster management was making me unhinged, and that he was desperately, valiantly trying to protect Harbor Slate from my rigid declining mental state. He had built his lie in concentric circles, ensuring that when he finally executed his grand theft, his own family would view him as a tragic corporate savior rather than a common, greedy embezzler. While Gavin's family foundation completely shattered, my corporate foundation solidified into unbreakable steel. The veteran field operations teams of Harbor Slate, the seasoned project managers, the heavy equipment operators, and the regional logistics coordinators issued a unified, entirely unprompted declaration. They bypassed the standard corporate hierarchy and sent a formal, physically signed memorandum directly to the advisory board. The document explicitly stated that the entire field division would only accept operational directives from Ella Ward. They had not forgotten the brutal reality of our industry. They vividly remembered the aftermath of the Category 4 hurricane that struck the Gulf Coast 3 years ago. They remembered that I was the one who slept on aluminum folding cots, in sweltering, mosquito-infested staging tents for 3 weeks straight, eating cold military rations right beside them to ensure the supply lines remained open. Gavin, they noted with pure, unfiltered blue-collar disdain, only ever showed up to the disaster zones wearing a pristine, perfectly pressed safety vest when the local news affiliates had their television cameras rolling. Thousands of miles away, the sun-drenched tropical paradise of Maui was rapidly transforming into a claustrophobic, high-stress prison. Sloane Mercer was a brilliant operational mind, but her ambition had completely blinded her to Gavin's glossy, superficial veneer. As our legal blockade aggressively choked off their access to the stolen corporate funds, the financial reality of their situation crashed down upon them. Owen Hart had continued to monitor the routed network traffic, and he intercepted a frantic, unsecured email Sloane had sent to one of Gavin's secondary accounts. She had finally forced Gavin to open his encrypted personal ledgers. She discovered the catastrophic truth about the offshore sports betting. Gavin was not just hiding a few $1,000s in casual gambling debts. He was actively drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of high-interest, incredibly dangerous liabilities. Sloane finally understood the horrific reality of the bed she had made. She had not married a victorious corporate kingmaker who was going to hand her a multi-million-dollar exit strategy. She had permanently shackled herself to a ticking financial time bomb. The man she had destroyed her entire professional reputation for was nothing more than a desperate, panicking addict using her highly tuned operational skills as a meat shield. The fracture between the newlywed couple was immediate, bitter, and deeply toxic. Back in Atlanta, sitting in the absolute quiet of my heavily secured townhouse, I absorbed the totality of the situation. This was the exact moment I experienced the deepest, most profound psychological ache of the entire ordeal. It was not the superficial sting of physical infidelity. It was the crushing, suffocating realization of Gavin's true nature. I finally understood that my husband had never actually wanted to be a builder. He had never harbored any genuine desire to carry the heavy stones, to pour the difficult concrete, or to weather the terrifying storms by my side. He only ever wanted to stand in front of the magnificent skyscraper I had built with my own hands, flashing his perfectly engineered smile, so the entire world would simply assume his hands had somehow created it. He was a parasite of prestige, feeding off my endurance. A weaker woman might have collapsed under the immense weight of that realization. She might have surrendered to the grief, pulling the blinds down and fading into the background. But I absolutely refused to grant them the satisfaction of witnessing my ruin. Instead of crumbling, I aggressively reclaimed the physical territory of my own existence. I forcefully resurrected my punishing, highly disciplined daily schedule. At exactly 5 o'clock every single morning, long before the sun rose over the city, I laced up my running shoes and pounded the humid, dark pavement of my Atlanta neighborhood for 5 grueling miles. I directed my energy into a rigorous, steady exertion, allowing my accelerated pulse and deep, grounding breaths to cleanse the harsh adrenaline and persistent sorrow from my body. I returned home, showered in freezing water, and sat at my kitchen island, ensuring I ate my meals at exactly the same hour every single day. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the Harbor Slate Executive Suite at exactly 7:30 in the morning, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. I spoke significantly fewer words during our executive board meetings, but the operational directives I issued were brutally sharp, perfectly calculated, and executed with zero hesitation. This is the very modern, very American reality of how a strong woman survives a catastrophic betrayal. You do not weep. You take back your own body. You reclaim your own schedule. You lock down your own mind. I was treating my personal emotional recovery with the exact same ruthless, uncompromising efficiency I applied to rebuilding a devastated coastal city after a hurricane. The entire nature of the war fundamentally shifted within my chest during those quiet, regimented days. I realized with absolute clarity that I was no longer fighting merely to punish a cheating husband and a treacherous business partner. Vengeance is a temporary, exhausting, and ultimately hollow fuel. I was fighting for something significantly more vital and permanent. I was fighting to aggressively protect my name, to secure the financial future of the company I birthed, and to rescue the absolute best version of myself from being permanently erased and rewritten by 2 incredibly greedy, pathetic thieves. The legal machinery of Fulton County moved with surprising speed when presented with a meticulously documented petition for emergency corporate injunctive relief. The Superior Court judge reviewed Miriam Cross's initial filings and immediately scheduled a heavily restricted emergency hearing in Atlanta. The docket outlined 3 specific mandates: the absolute confirmation of my sole executive control over Harbor Slate, the freezing and preservation of all marital assets, and a permanent, legally binding restraining order barring both my husband and his new wife from coming within 1,000 feet of any company server, physical office, or field operation. Facing the terrifying reality of a public courtroom, Gavin's newly retained defense attorney frantically petitioned for a private, pre-hearing mediation. Gavin desperately wanted to pull me into a quiet room. He was hoping to leverage our shared history, play on the residual emotions of our marriage, and somehow negotiate a settlement that would quietly bury the mountains of forensic evidence before they became public record. I agreed to the meeting, but strictly on my own uncompromising terms. There would be no private, intimate conversations. We would meet in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of Miriam's Atlanta affiliate office. Both legal teams would be present, and a certified court reporter would meticulously transcribe every single syllable spoken. We convened at 10 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday morning. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly suffocating, thick with the heavy, unspoken tension of a high-stakes psychological war. A small black digital recording device sat dead center on the polished mahogany table, its red light glowing like a silent warning beacon. Gavin and Sloane sat on the opposite side of the table, separated by an intentional, glaring foot of empty space. The tropical tan from their Hawaiian trip had entirely faded, replaced by the pale, exhausted complexion of 2 people who had spent the last 96 hours staring into the absolute abyss of federal prison. Gavin leaned forward, attempting to deploy the smooth, modulated, reassuring voice that had once manipulated entire boardrooms. He looked directly into my eyes, searching for the woman who used to pack his luggage. "Ella, please," Gavin began, his voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. "These personal matters have gone entirely too far. We are about to destroy each other's futures over a broken marriage. We are adults. We should be able to find a civilized exit strategy that does not involve destroying the company we both love." I did not blink. I did not shift my posture. I let his hollow words hang in the freezing air of the conference room. before Miriam could even respond. The fragile alliance across the table violently fractured. Sloane was a survivor, and she possessed the predatory instinct to recognize exactly when a sinking ship was going down. She heard Gavin positioning himself as the reasonable peacemaker, subtly framing the conflict as a mutual marital dispute rather than a calculated corporate theft. She realized he was preparing to throw her entirely to the wolves to save his own skin. Sloane turned sharply toward him, her voice laced with pure venom. "Do not dare play the victim here. Gavin, you were the one who initiated the entire smear campaign against her. You were the one who fed those lies to the regional business reporters. You forced me to go through with that ridiculous public wedding ceremony on the beach because you swore it was the only way to lock in the optics for the investors." Gavin's jaw tightened, his eyes darting frantically toward his defense attorney, silently begging the man to intervene. But the lawyer remained perfectly still, realizing his clients were actively destroying their own defense on a recorded line. "You told me the private equity fund would only buy the shares if we presented a stable, married front," Sloane continued, her voice rising in panic. "You lied to me about your debts. You lied about having her operational access codes." Miriam Cross leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. She possessed the icy demeanor of an executioner about to pull the lever. It was time to place the knives squarely on the table. "Let us be absolutely clear about the reality of your current situation," Miriam stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "We are not here to mediate a broken heart. We are here to discuss your organized, prosecutable fraud." Miriam slid 4 single, unadorned sheets of paper across the polished wood. She did not provide the full dossiers, she merely provided the receipts. "Exhibit A," Miriam said, tapping the first page. "The recovered email directive instructing your assistant to illegally backdate the executive board minutes. Exhibit B, the precise wireless network logs from the Maui resort, verifying your active attempt to forge electronic signatures on corporate governance documents at exactly 11:52 at night. Exhibit C, your documented, written request to our external security contractor to clone my client's master authentication token. And Exhibit D, the financial spreadsheet outlining your exact timeline to illegally dilute her founding equity." I watched Gavin's face as he read the summarized pages. The polished, charismatic brand architect completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, cornered man. But Miriam was not finished. She leaned back in her chair and delivered the fatal blow. "Furthermore," Miriam added casually, as if discussing the weather, "you should know that the investment fund based in Austin formally withdrew their acquisition offer at exactly 8 o'clock this morning after receiving our legal preservation notice. Oh, and our forensic team flagged a highly aggressive inquiry on your personal credit profile late yesterday. It appears one of your offshore sports betting creditors has accelerated your loan repayment schedule due to your sudden, massive litigation risk." All the blood drained from Gavin's face. He was completely trapped. The exit doors were sealed, the money was gone, and the sharks were actively circling. In a final, pathetic act of desperation, Gavin bypassed his own attorney and looked directly at me. He offered the only trade he thought he had left. "Ella, listen to me," Gavin pleaded, his voice cracking, shedding the last remnants of his pride. "I will sign a complete, uncontested marital waiver right now. I will walk away from every single dime of the personal estate. I will publicly take the blame for the divorce, and I will ensure there is absolutely no scandal attached to your name. Just drop the corporate fraud investigation. Let me walk away cleanly from Harbor's slate." He truly, fundamentally still did not understand me, even now, staring at the absolute ruin of his life. He believed that my anger was rooted in a broken heart. He thought that if he just sacrificed the marriage and offered me a clean emotional slate, I would be willing to negotiate away a massive corporate crime. He thought my feelings could be bought. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the table. I looked at the man I had slept next to for years, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. "You are offering me a marital concession to buy your way out of a felony," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. yet it commanded the entire room. You fundamentally miscalculate the nature of my anger. Gavin, this is no longer about you sleeping with my operating partner. You attempted to manipulate the payroll of my employees. You jeopardized critical recovery contracts with hospitals that rely on our logistics to keep their emergency rooms functioning. You manipulated the emergency supply chain, and you actively tried to destroy the professional reputation that hundreds of families rely on to feed their children. I stood up, signaling to Miriam that the mediation was entirely over. I looked down at the two shattered people sitting across from me. I do not want your apologies, I stated coldly. I do not care about your public statements, and I am absolutely not dropping the investigation. I am going to let the federal authorities dissect every single fraudulent document you created. As Miriam and I gathered our briefcases and turned toward the heavy glass door, the absolute silence in the room was deafening. I glanced back one final time. I saw the exact moment the horrifying truth finally registered behind Gavin's panicked eyes. The most terrifying reality of his existence was no longer the threat of prison or the crushing weight of his gambling debts. The true terror was the realization that I did not hate him. Hate requires passion. Hate requires a lingering emotional attachment. As I walked out of the room, he finally understood that I had completely ceased viewing him as a husband a long time ago. I looked at him and saw nothing more than a severe, toxic legal liability, and I was simply a chief executive officer executing the necessary, uncompromising protocol to neutralize that liability permanently. The morning of the final emergency hearing broke with a harsh, unyielding glare over the city of Atlanta. I did not dress for mourning, and I certainly did not dress for a dramatic marital showdown. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom and selected a sharply tailored, dark gray structured suit. I wore absolutely no jewelry, save for a simple, functional steel watch. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Superior Court exactly 15 minutes before 9 o'clock, I did not look like a devastated, betrayed wife desperately seeking emotional justice. I looked exactly like what I was, a fiercely protective chief executive officer arriving to defend her corporate assets from hostile internal threats. Gavin and Sloane arrived at the courthouse in completely separate vehicles. When they finally entered the heavily guarded courtroom, they deliberately chose seats on the far opposite ends of the respondents' bench. A thick, suffocating chasm of empty wooden space stretched between them. Their highly publicized, tropical destination wedding had occurred barely 2 weeks ago, but sitting under the sterile, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the legal system, it was glaringly obvious to every single person in the room that their marriage was already a pile of cold, dead ash. It was a spectacular firework that had burned out the exact second the stolen money stopped flowing. The presiding judge called the room to order, and Miriam Cross took the floor. She did not waste a single breath on emotional grandstanding. She operated with cold, mechanical precision. She systematically presented the chronological timeline of their conspiracy. She laid out the initial infidelity, the quiet establishment of the Shell Liability Company, the staggering offshore sports betting debts Gavin had accumulated, the meticulous plan to forcefully push me out of my own executive chair, the entirely fabricated psychological evaluation, and their frantic, desperate attempt to sign fraudulent governance documents on the very night of their wedding. Miriam then began to call our witnesses to formally enter their affidavits into the permanent court record. Lila Perez stepped up to the microphone, her voice shaking slightly as her resolve absolutely firm. She testified under oath regarding Gavin's explicit, terrifying demands to illegally backdate the executive board minutes and forge my schedule. Jordan Pike took the stand next, a picture of rigid technological integrity. He confirmed the exact date and time Gavin had ordered him to illegally clone my master authentication token, flatly stating he had refused because the request violated every standard security protocol of Harbor Slate. Following the technological timeline, Owen Hart took the floor. He functioned as our financial executioner, with pristine, easily digestible charts displayed on the courtroom monitors. Owen traced the convoluted flow of the stolen money. He explained exactly how Sloane had utilized the shell company to siphon funds, and he detailed the catastrophic, real-world consequences our hospital clients would have faced if I had not immediately severed their access to the corporate treasury. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy when Celeste Vale was called forward. She looked deeply exhausted, carrying the profound, invisible weight of a woman who knew she was actively hammering the final nails into her own brother's legal coffin. Yet, when the judge asked for her statement, Celeste did not waver. She looked directly at the bench and stated, clearly and unequivocally, that Gavin had contacted her several months prior, aggressively seeking legal strategies to weaponize a fabricated mental illness against me to bypass our prenuptial protections. She testified that his intent to destroy my standing was premeditated, cold, and entirely financially motivated. Gavin's defense attorney looked physically ill. He had absolutely nothing to counter the mountain of pristine, verified evidence. But Miriam Cross had saved the most devastating, absolute twist for the final minute of her presentation. "Your Honor," Miriam said, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. "We have one final piece of audio discovery. Late yesterday evening, we successfully subpoenaed the communication logs from one of Mr. Vale's primary illicit creditors. We recovered a voicemail my client's husband left for this bookmaker on the exact morning of his wedding ceremony in Maui." Miriam pressed a button on her laptop. The audio was crystal clear, echoing sharply off the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. "Look, just give me until Monday." Gavin's panicked, hushed voice filled the room. "I am handling it. By Monday morning, I will officially have Ella's controlling shares unlocked. We have the private equity buyers completely lined up. The payout from the buyout will cover the entire principal and all the interest I owe you. Just do not touch my accounts until Monday." The entire courtroom fell into an absolutely stunned, breathless silence. That single, desperate voicemail was the ultimate kill shot. It completely obliterated their carefully crafted public relations narrative. It proved, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that the sudden wedding on the beach was never a spontaneous act of true love or a brave escape from a toxic marriage. The marriage itself was nothing more than a functional, calculated step in an aggressive corporate fraud scheme. Sloane had been a willing accomplice, but Gavin had ultimately used their wedding vows as collateral to appease a violent bookmaker. The judge did not need to deliberate for long. The gavel fell with a loud, satisfying crack. The court issued an immediate, sweeping emergency order. The judge formally voided every single board resolution, contract alteration, and governance document Gavin and Sloane had touched or attempted to sign over the past 90 days. Citing overwhelming evidence of fraud and malicious intent, the judge granted a permanent, highly restrictive injunction, completely barring both of them from ever accessing any Harbor Slate system, physical property, or client site. My absolute unilateral control over the company I founded was legally cemented and protected by the full weight of the state. Furthermore, the judge brutally upheld the strict terms of our postnuptial agreement. Gavin was legally blocked from touching a single fraction of a % of my founder's shares. Even more devastating for him, the judge ruled that all the corporate funds he had secretly diverted to fund his gambling addiction, his affair, and his failed corporate coup were to be legally classified as an intentional, malicious dissipation of marital assets. Gavin was now personally, legally responsible for repaying every single stolen dollar back to my estate. Several months later, the suffocating dust of the legal war had finally settled. The chaotic storm had passed, leaving behind a perfectly clean, reinforced foundation. Harbor Slate not only survived the scandal, but we actually expanded. We easily retained the massive Florida hospital contract. The prestigious private equity fund out of Austin formally returned to the negotiating table. But this time, their executives only spoke directly to me, and the valuation of my company had increased by 20%. Gavin and Sloane, meanwhile, were hopelessly trapped in a suffocating web of federal civil suits, crippling legal fees, and the terrifying reality of the massive gambling debts they mistakenly thought the Hawaiian sun would magically erase. They were entirely ruined, isolated by the industry, and actively turning on each other to survive the incoming criminal investigations. On a crisp, clear Thursday evening, I stood in the grand lobby of a massive regional hospital in coastal Louisiana. It was the official handover ceremony for a facility my company had spent the last 18 months completely resurrecting after a catastrophic hurricane. The lobby was filled with brilliant doctors, grateful administrators, and my incredibly resilient field teams. I was standing near the towering glass windows when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my blazer. I pulled it out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a massive, sprawling text message from Gavin, sent from a new unrecognized number. The preview lines were filled with desperate apologies, pathetic excuses, and begging pleas for a second chance. I did not even bother to unlock the screen. I simply pressed the side button, sending his desperate digital noise into the absolute void, and blocked the number. I turned my attention back to the celebration. My lead project manager handed me a heavy, leather-bound portfolio containing the finalized documents for a new aggressive profit-sharing program I had designed exclusively for our veteran field employees. I picked up my pen, signed my name with sharp, confident strokes, and handed it back with a smile. I looked up at the beautifully restored building, the bright, steady lights shining out into the dark evening, completely immune to the storms outside. I took a deep breath of the cool air and finally understood the absolute truth. The most perfect, devastating revenge was never about destroying Gavin and Sloane. It was simply about ruthlessly keeping exactly what was mine and stepping aside to let them be completely crushed under the unbearable, pathetic weight of who they truly were. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to hear your thoughts. So please comment down below where you are listening from so we can connect and share our perspectives. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your ultimate support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.